Hi, good evening, or shall I say good night? Or if in the morning we say grand rising, shall I say grand falling? I don't know, but it is 20 minutes before 12 o'clock midnight out here on the East Coast in New York City on February the 5th. 2021. Amazing how fast time flies. And so on this beautiful Friday night, I was actually listening to some nice R&B music, and something told me to pick up this book. So I ordered a copy of this book from Amazon. And it came recommended by my clinical supervisor. As most of you guys know, I'm in my 5th year of my PhD program of clinical psychology, where I'm in my pre-doc internship out here in New York City. And so I do psych evals, and I see clients for psychotherapy. And part of that process obviously involves supervision of my clinical cases. And I'm not the only one in the internship, so I do have a co-intern where we meet with a number of supervisors actually. But one of my supervisors, who is actually oriented in the psychodynamic, psychoanalytic, theoretical school of thought, actually recommended this book in response to a case that was discussed by my co-intern. And I find it quite interesting because when she recommended the book, like during the supervision meeting actually, which happened maybe a couple weeks ago, while we were having the meeting, I actually went on Amazon and I researched the book. And I was like, oh, the book is actually only 25. I think it was like 25 cents or 50 cents. It was like, yo, it was so economical. I was like, why not purchase it, right? So I went ahead and bought the book following the supervision meeting, but I hadn't opened it yet. And so like I'm sitting here listening to my nice R&B music and my vibe. I'm just relaxed and chilling on this wonderful Friday night. And something told me, pick up the book. Just pick up this book. It's been sitting here in my living room, just sitting there, I don't know, just taking in the vibes, I guess, of my space. This book just has been just present here in my space. And something drew me to this book. Like, just open it. Just open it, Danielle, and see what's inside. And I just did that, you guys. Before I went live, before I came live here in this video, I actually just did that. And it's called, by the way, it's called The Clinical Detective. Techniques in the Evaluation of Sexual Abuse. And it came recommended because, you know, there was a case that was mentioned in our supervision meeting by my co-intern regarding abuse. I don't think it was sexual, though. So I'm wondering, like, why this book in particular that she would recommend. But it probably could apply to, like, all different types of abuse, not just sexual abuse. So when I just picked it up, like, I randomly flipped to a page, and I landed on page 175, and I began reading, and I'm taken aback. I'm like, this is a damn pretty fucking good book. And granted, this book was published in the year of 1992, at least that's when the copyright was made for this book, by Aaron Noah Horowitz. 1992. In 1992, I was only like 9 years old. I was such a little girl. Oh, those were the good old days. But the author is a chief psychologist and clinical director. I'm not sure if he currently is this. I'm not sure if this is current status. But at the time the book was published, he was the chief psychologist and clinical director of the United Services for Children and Adolescents, a public mental health agency serving the children and families of Rensselaer County, New York. I never heard of that county before. But anyway, he has a private practice in Schenectady and teaches at St. Rose College, Russell Sage College, and Albany Medical School. Basically, he has credibility, okay? So, granted, like I said, before I went live, I picked up this book because it was just sitting there, like, in my living room, just kind of looking at me, I guess, begging for me to pick it up and just open it and read it. You guys know how, like, I'm not sure I'm the only one. You guys probably have books that are just sitting on your bookshelf, just sitting there. You've ordered the book. You have not opened the book, though, to read it. I decided to open the book at this time of night. And granted, you know, it's a Friday. Most of us are off work tomorrow. I'm off work tomorrow, so I don't have work in the morning. So I'm just up. I'm just up, chilling, relaxing. After this video, I'm about to head to bed. But I had to go live because I randomly landed on this page 175, and I'm like, wow. That's how you know it's a good book, because when you can like randomly land on a page and it grabs your attention, like it snatches you. I'm just like, damn. You guys know, of course, I am in the literary world. I do own a non-profit literary organization. I founded back in 2010. Actually, it was really conceived in my mind in 2009. But it became a real deal, a real entity in 2010. Back when I was living in Atlanta, Georgia, and it's called UBAWA. Of course, I gotta do a little plug here, but it's called UBAWA, which stands for Urban Books, Authors, and Writers of America. And it's a pretty rapidly growing literary organization targeted towards African American self-published authors. So, as an author myself, and a devout promoter of authors who, you know, devote themselves to the literary arts, like, I love a good book. And it's rare that you get your hands on a really good book. But you know you have your hands on a really good book when you can randomly land, like, just open the book, just random. That's what I did. Like, I randomly, like, literally, I picked up the book, randomly opened the book, landed on page 175, and I'm like, okay, so I wanted to share this with you guys. Now, like I said, I am, like, in the middle of this chapter. It is part 3 of a chapter entitled Evaluation. So if you're curious, you guys can go and buy the book yourself and read the entire book. I am not about to give a complete synopsis of this book, but it is chapter 8 entitled Techniques to Amplify a Story's Strengths and Weaknesses. Alright, so I want to read you guys this little excerpt, and I want to get your perspective. Now, granted, of course, this is coming from a clinical perspective. Alright, so this is for a mature audience only. And you guys know I do work in the field of mental health. And in the field of mental health, we come across a lot of interesting cases, to say the least, with very sensitive issues that are at hand. So let me just go ahead and begin reading. This is a conversation. I love books that are, like, heavy in conversation. There's a lot of quotes here. It says, "What do you mean he's outraged? What is he doing with his hands down his son's pants? He's outraged that you think he's engaging in a sexual act. But he is. He's obviously getting something out of it for himself. nothing but his son's pleasure. He's indignant that you're implying that he gets off on it in a sexual way. He's simply scratching and tickling and massaging his son's back and buttocks in a nightly bedtime ritual that he's been engaging in ever since his son was 18 months old. Now, that's enough for me to say, okay. Now, granted, I have not read this book. I have not read the entire case. This is my very first time. Like, I glanced at this excerpt here before I went live, but I have not read the chapter. I have not read the book, so I don't really have a good, solid, contextual understanding of what's happening in this case particularly, but just from what I just read, okay. But on his son's butt, the area he tickles and massages extends quietly naturally from the boy's back to his butt. The area he tickles and massages extends quite naturally from the boy's back to his butt. Interesting how I just read that twice, you guys. But his butt isn't his back, isn't it? Where exactly do you draw the line? At the waist. What an imaginary belt line. Why there? Isn't that kind of arbitrary? His son keeps saying, "Go lower, Daddy. That feels good, Daddy. Do it lower." But he keeps going lower, all the way to the bottom of his son's butt, all the way to his thighs. Right. But is there really a reason to draw a line? Keep in mind that he's not inserting his finger in his son's anus or anything of that sort. He's simply massaging and tickling, just like he does on his son's back. And he forgets to do his son's butt. His son reminds him by saying, "Daddy, go lower. Go lower." Does this sound sexual to you? For you guys are watching. I know you guys aren't trained or credentialed in this area. Most of you guys probably aren't. But just for the general public, I'm just throwing it out there. This is a question for you guys. Does this sound sexual to you? But is that a reason to do it? Just because his son is turned on and asks for it, isn't any excuse for the adult to go on doing it. But he says that his son isn't turned on in any sexual way. Hi, Andrea. So I'm reading an excerpt for you guys who just joined my live. I'm reading an excerpt from this book here entitled The Clinical Detective, Techniques in the Evaluation of Sexual Abuse. But he says that his son isn't turned on in any sexual way. He regards massaging his son's buttocks as no different from massaging his son's back. If he stopped now, would his son understand why? What's Daddy's reason for not going lower? Is that what you would tell him? Yes, that's inappropriate to touch his son there. He'll tell you that you're outside the limits of your expertise and that you're imposing your misguided value judgments on his relationship with his son. He'll tell you that he knows his son better than you do and cares more than you do about his son's welfare. He'll insist that his son doesn't think of this massage as sexual. He says his son loves it and depends on this routine each night and would not understand any reasons for discontinuing it. Yo, I swear, like, this excerpt that I just read makes me want to read more. But I'm not going to read more. However, I will read you guys the synopsis for this book here, which is on the inner flap of the book, in the front of the book. So it says that this extraordinarily readable and highly practical book walks a clinician through the process of conducting a sexual abuse evaluation, whose purpose is to figure out whether sexual abuse actually occurred and what needs to be done about it. Written largely in dialogues, which I said that I like. You know, I like a book that has a lot of dialogue. Substantial dialogue. Written largely in dialogues between supervisor and clinician. And when I read that, like before I went live, like I knew it was a clinician talking to the supervisor, right? Because that's what we do. Like, yo, it's funny because it's recently, like, every year, right, APIC, which is, you know, APA, American Psychological Association, has a match process where they match pre-doc psychology doctoral students to an APA accredited pre-doc internship. So I went through the process a year ago, which I started my pre-doc internship last year. And this year, not even a couple weeks ago, we actually just did interviews at my current site for the next cohort of interns that will be working at the site where I work. And part of my role was to answer any questions that the applicants had regarding my experience as a pre-doc intern, right? And so I say that to say that one of the questions that, you know, they ask a lot of questions to the interns, right? Like, what's your experience like? And I'm like, yo, at this point, I mean, I just had to keep it real. Like, I am super biased out. The thing about going through a doctoral program, you get a lot of supervision. It's heavy on the supervision, you guys. Like, we've been through so much supervision. It's crazy. We're talking about, before I got to this point in my training, I had 3 800-hour practicum rotations. 3. Each rotation is a year long. Each year-long rotation, that's 800 hours, involves supervision. The supervision, we have supervision weekly, right? So we have group supervision, 2 hours, didactic, 2 hours, and individual supervision, which is usually like an hour. We're talking about like 5 hours of supervision in 1 week, each and every week for the entire year, right? So I say that to say, like, supervision can be great, but it's just like a lot of supervision. So when I read this, I automatically knew, because granted, like, I've been in a lot of supervision meetings, so you get the tone, you get the gist of what a supervision meeting sounds like. So as I was reading that excerpt, like, immediately I caught on and I knew that, okay, this is between a clinician and a supervisor. So basically, it says here, written largely in dialogues between supervisor and clinician, and between clinician and child, it focuses not on the dramatic cases of obvious abuse. That's why I was like, okay, I'm reading them like, it's clearly inappropriate, right? So even the author says, like, it's obvious, not on the dramatic cases of obvious abuse, but on the tough cases where the evidence is ambiguous, motives are mixed and confusion reigns. So it makes me like wonder, like, okay, what other cases they present here where it's more ambiguous? Because that was a very clear case. Like, yo, that is clearly an approach. Like, what? Okay. Controversy often swirls around allegations of sexual abuse in the professional literature, replete with differences of opinion and conflicting research findings, is of little help. Yeah. Like, I've read so many research articles, like, by the time you reach this point in the training, like I'm a 5th year PhD student in clinical psychology, you're just like, okay, I am like researched out, like I am well read. You're well read at this point. Like, that's why I think it took me some time to open this book, because you've read so much to the point where you're like, okay, I'm okay if I don't read another book for like another couple years, because you've read so much, right? Now, granted, like I love to read. I grew up as a child who just had a passion for reading. I would lock myself in my room, literally, and isolate myself from my family and just read for hours and hours on end. So I love reading, but I mean, life is about balance, right? So there comes a time where you're like, okay, it's enough reading. It's enough. It's enough. It's enough. All right. Rather than emphasize literature reviews and research questions, this book provides practical guidance teaching the clinician what to do first and second and so on throughout the evaluation process. So, I mean, I guess it makes sense why my supervisor would recommend this to my co-intern, because I guess she has some questions about, like, you know, what's going on. And I guess it kind of came to her mind, like, as she was presenting her case, because usually supervision meetings, like, you know, it's kind of focused on like our cases, our clinical cases that we see. So I do psych evaluations where, you know, I administer psychological tests and I come up with the diagnosis, and I do a whole full psych report for the clients that I see, and I also do psychotherapy. And so, you know, of course, you know, as we're trained to become clinical psychologists, we're not licensed yet. We are on the path to get licensed. We're working under the supervision of several actually licensed psychologists, and we have several supervisors that we meet with, and, you know, things like this come up, and it's just like, interesting. The factors that make a sexual abuse evaluation different from other kinds of clinical work are highlighted. For example, a comprehensive approach is taught for differentiating true allegations of abuse from false ones. Oh, okay. So it makes sense now. Okay. Given this description of this book, it makes sense why my supervisor recommended this book to my co-intern, because there was some kind of like gray area. Like, okay, what's going on? Is it abuse? Is it not abuse? It was more like physical abuse that was brought up in the case presentation. However, the similarities between a sexual abuse evaluation and other kinds of clinical interviews are equally emphasized. I was wondering, like, okay, why recommend this book? Because the title says, like, the techniques in the evaluation of sexual abuse. I'm like, okay, that wasn't a sexual abuse case that was mentioned. It was more physical abuse, but okay. The attention to the details of what questions to ask, when, how to confirm or disconfirm a story, and how to spot a fabricated story will benefit all clinicians wishing to fine-tune their interview skills and clinical judgment. The book begins by conceptualizing the interview as a sequence of stages, then goes within these stages to take a microscopic look at the interview process in order to identify helpful and unhelpful interview behaviors, and finally ends by teaching the complicated process of putting all the information together to formulate conclusions and recommendations. Okay, I'm going to read this book. Numerous professionals with varied training, lawyers, Department of Social Service personnel, counselors and therapists, judges, teachers, etc. are likely to become involved in situations where sexual abuse has been charged, and all of them can benefit from the wisdom in this book. Wow. I'm going to read this book then. Okay. Seems like a really interesting book. So, having read that excerpt, I really want you guys to leave your thoughts below. So there were some reviews, a couple reviews on the back of the book left by an associate judge of the City of Atlanta, Clinton E. Devereaux, who left their review. It says the clinical detective is conversational, clear, and it's probably controversial too, though. I could imagine. Conversational, clear, and insightful, and comfortable yet challenging reading. The training and supervision, dialogues, and case examples help in thinking through how I listen to all witnesses, not only children involved in molestation and abuse cases. I intend to recommend it to other judges, to lawyers, and to court service workers who guide children and victims through the criminal process. I am going to read this book. I'm glad I picked it up. It's been sitting here for a couple weeks now, but I want you guys to feel free to share your thoughts, opinions, concerns. If some things have come up for you as I read that excerpt, if you feel comfortable sharing, feel free. And I'll catch you guys later. Good night.